It's my real pleasure to introduce first, to just kick us off and talk a little bit about how the administration is thinking about these issues, Danny Yegan, who is the Chief Economist at the Office of Management and Budget. It's such a pleasure to have him here. Thanks so much, Danny.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm excited despite the lack of the tie, but I'll show the excitement in my words. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be helping to kick off this really important discussion on racial equity and 21st century measurement with this really extraordinary panel. As Chief Economist of the Office of Management and Budget, I wear two hats. On the budget side, I lead tax work and long-term budget outlook work. On the management side, I get to help promulgate, measurement and evidence throughout government. And in this administration, a critical effort is underway to measure equities and inequities in government action. And to kind of tell the story, before getting chief in front of my name, I had professor as an economics professor at UC Berkeley. And for years, under the IRS's Joint Statistical Research Program and with Treasury Department co-authors, I conducted approved research with de-identified tax return data. And in that research, it's on actual government policies. We inevitably needed to analyze potential disparities, inequities. There was data on income, so we could test for disparities by income. There was data on age, so we could test for disparities between old and young. Data on marital status, even data on home ownership, but no data on race. As we all know here, the United States federal statistical system presents unique challenges and unique opportunities. Unlike in France, the federal government here does collect race and ethnicity data, both by the Census Bureau and by the Social Security Administration. There are other sources as well. But unlike some other countries, the data are not all available to be merged, often for deliberate statutory reasons. On day one of his presidency, President Biden signed the executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. That was day one. And that executive order launched whole of government work, including equity assessments and plans by each federal agency. And equity work requires measurement. On measurement, the executive order tells a story. Many federal data sets are not disaggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, disability, income, veteran status, or other key demographic variables. And this lack of data has cascading effects, and it impedes efforts to measure and advance equity. And so a first step to promoting equity in government action is to gather the data necessary to inform that effort. And so the executive order created the Equitable Data Working Group. And this group is convened by OMB's Chief Statistician of the United States and the Office of Science and Technology Policy's United States Chief Technology Office, so members of the Executive Office of the President, with membership comprising leaders from across EOP, the Commerce Department, Treasury Department, and elsewhere. And our charge is to identify where are there existing measurement inadequacies, how can we support agencies in implementing actions consistent with the applicable law and privacy interests that expand and refine the equity data available so that the federal government can measure equity and capture the diversity of the American people. And that work is underway. We are identifying and making tangible progress toward the necessary data collection, data sharing to answer specific equity measurement questions with full data safety and privacy protections under applicable statutes. So this is big work. It's important work. We have our work cut out for us, but it is just so important for building back better with a focus on racial equity. And it's in that context that I'm so excited to learn from the extraordinary panelists we have today, from the audience questions, and that hopefully foster more wind in each other's backs in this vitally important work from where we each sit. So thanks so much, and I'll pass it back to you, Austin.
Great. Thank you so much for being with us today, Danny. I'm really excited that the admin is prioritizing this work and looking forward to what we learned today. All right, so I'm going to pass it now to, we have two guests who are going to sort of have a discussion, and they are first Rhonda Vonche Sharp, who is an economist and also the president and founder of the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race. She is a former president of the National Economic Association. We're so pleased to have her here today to speak with Tracey Ross, who is the Director of Federal Policy and Narrative Change at PolicyLink. And they're going to talk a little bit about what motivates them to be involved in this work and some of the work that they are doing now. So welcome, Rhonda and Tracey, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you, Austin, for the invitation. I'm excited to be here to have a conversation with Tracey Ross. So Tracey, I'm going to get us started. So tell us a little bit about, or tell me a little bit about why you do this work and what exactly PolicyLink does, like, so how you, this.
Yeah. And first, I want to also echo thanks to Austin and the organizers of this event. It's good seeing you, Rhonda, and that we unconsciously matched for this conversation. But I always, whenever I introduce myself and why I entered this work, I always start with the fact that I was raised in Oakland, California, which is actually where I am now these days. PolicyLink is headquartered in Oakland, California. So it's a bit unusual that a director of federal policy wouldn't be in Washington, D.C., though I did spend most of my career in D.C. But growing up in Oakland and being the child of two people who were born and raised in Oakland, I got to see from an early age how where you live impacts your opportunities. So I was really cognizant of the fact that, you know, my mother grew up in a working class Black neighborhood, and my father, he grew up in a very poor, low income Black neighborhood and was raised in housing projects. And just even those little differences between them, I could see how it impacted my mother's path and being able to go to college, and my father just not having very many opportunities. And when you're, visiting family throughout the city, you see very easily how, some neighborhoods will have just trees and houses that are upkept, and visiting cousins in other areas, and how, my aunts and uncles would be like, okay, we're having to sleep on the floor because it's New Year's and it's dangerous. And so just seeing how one city, you could go to various different neighborhoods and have an entirely different story. And so that always has left an imprint on me. So when I started work, I always cared about public service out of necessity. My parents would always take me to protest, or I'd be at the picket line with my father and his union. So I was interested in service out of necessity. But then as I started studying and learning and realizing that the things that I experienced as qualitative data was actually captured by people when they realized your zip code impacts your life outcomes, that Black children born into the middle class have downward social mobility compared to their white counterparts born into the middle class with upward social mobility. And so it was like slowly unpacking and discovering that what I saw was all by design. And so it was like I was flying blind into this work by just having a hunch of what I need to address, but then really realizing that our public policy shaped all of this, and that helped to dictate the career and where I am today. At PolicyLink, we focus on racial and social equity. we take a comprehensive approach to policymaking. So thinking about how communications and narrative creates the enabling environment, how data can drive policy, how policy should come from the people closest to the problems. And so that's just a little teaser. I can talk a lot more about policy, but that's a bit about how I came to this. And I know you heard a little bit of that when we checked in last week, but I didn't get to hear too much about your story, and I'd love to hear how you came to this work.
So I appreciate it. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think, when you talked about your father and the zip code, you could see it on my face, because I think so much in this work, you read the research, but you don't always get an opportunity to see someone whose life is the very research that you do. And so, for me, I grew up in mathematics. That's where I spent the bulk of my time in math and engineering, but always very conscious, socially conscious. And I would, tell people when I started to study economics, the thing that at first I used to get in trouble about was just answering and circling the box, because that's what you do in the math, right? I found my answer, I circle the box, and I'm done. And now econ was asking me to tell a story about what I had found. And I talked to my mathematician buddies, and I'm like, look, in math, the word problem that says Susie has X numbers, dimes, nickels, quarters, how much money does she have? In math, you solve that and you're done. And in econ, I have to start thinking about who Susie is. Is she Black? Is she white? Is she married? Is she not married? Does she have children? Where does she live? All of these other factors about who Susie is that impacts her outcomes is what I had to think about in econ, and not realizing that my dissertation, which is on mathematical finance, I actually provide options for, because that's what it's about, options for financial aid for women by race, not ethnicity, and also for men. So not just women in the aggregate or men in the aggregate. I consider myself a reforming academic. I spent 18 years in academia, and then in 2016 started the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, primarily because as I was thinking about who Susie was, Susie would be called Susie or woman, and I would find that they weren't talking about you and me, that woman was synonymous with white. And if they were talking about me and you, or later who will be part of the panel, Mora, it was always like, comma, it would say women except Black and Hispanic women, was always this deficit-based lens, or there would be a paragraph that would talk about us, and you wouldn't see Rakeen, who is going to be on the panel later, at all, any conversation about Asian or Native American women. And as I aged, lived experiences, just found that more and more frustrating. And so one of the things that we really our mission at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race is crafting reports that expand women's focused research to center Asian, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and multiracial women. And I tell our researchers that we avoid doing the comparison. So to talk about Black women relative to white women, but I may talk about Black women relative to other Black women, right? Just to avoid that comparison, as if to say that Asian, Black, Native American, and Hispanic women aren't enough on their own, right? That we always have to be compared to white women to explain what our situation is, or what our circumstances, or to put some, I don't even know, say light, but I think it's important when we frame that, if we're always referencing to white women, or if you're only talking about us from a deficit-based lens. And so for me, I think I do this work, as anyone in the audience has heard me say, because I want to see myself in the data. And I want to see all of me. I want to see me as a Black woman, and sometimes I refer to that as an American descendant of slave who's not married, I should say, never married. I don't have children, I'm educated, and I own property, right? Like, I want to read a report, and I want other women to read a report and say, yes, you are talking about me. And having said that, as we're talking about this conversation about data, Now, I recognize that it is a challenge sometimes, as Danny said earlier. Sometimes the data don't allow you, right, to disaggregate around the complexities that influence an outcome. And that's what we want people to do. When we talk about disaggregating data, we're not talking about by race or by gender, but we want people to do that at the intersection that they think influences an outcome, because I think that's where you see the nuances, right? As you were talking about, being in charge of policy narratives, I think it is in those nuances when we think about the complexities of who we are and how that influences an outcome that will allow us to have targeted policies. We interviewed a woman named Alicia Netterville about 3 weeks ago. And one of the things she said about the Equal Pay Act is that it shouldn't be race neutral, because it is only about gender, and it doesn't address the fact that if you and I or Marie are paid less than a white woman, we have no recourse there, because it's not about intergender inequality. And so I think about that in the work that we do, right, to ask people to disaggregate more broadly, right, around those characteristics. So it seems that in many instances we come to this work from our lived experiences, right, that shape that very much shape what we do. So I said a little bit about how I approach this, thinking about how we disaggregate data, the ways that we want folks to do it. And so what's been your approach in terms of thinking about policy change? And I think more importantly, the policy narratives around.
So one of the, and I love that it feels like our conversation, it's flowing from lived experience, but translating into actual tools, and how, both of our institutions and individually how we work. But one of the important resources that we have at PolicyLink is our National Equity Atlas. And in it, we deeply disaggregate data. So how you were referring to a lot of data sets, they won't have even AAPI communities reference. And in our data set, we're talking about how it's insufficient to even say AAPI. Because you could, look at a community and say, well, Asian Americans are doing relatively well. But when you deeply disaggregate the data, you might see that the Hmong community is not doing well, or Filipinos aren't doing well, and that it's trying to get the full story of how a community is impacted, or how a subgroup is doing really well. So what are the policies that are allowing them to flourish, and how can we ensure that those benefits are being extended to all people? And so deeply disaggregated data is incredibly important to us, but also something important about the Atlas is, you can download all of our data sets. You can, you can look at, the 150 largest cities. You can look at the local level, and you can play around with it. We really want to make sure that we're democratizing data, and that we're really embedding community voice. Because something that you said to me when we were talking before, I talked about a project that we did where in Fairfax County, Virginia, and how it's a relatively prosperous area. It's consistently, on top places to live. But when you disaggregate the data, we were able to show leaders there that inequality was hiding in plain sight. And that by our measures, they were losing out on $26 billion in potential GDP because of gaps, racial income gaps. And I had said that we were able to tell, the data told the story. And you were like, no, the researchers told the story, right? And I was glad that you pushed back on me, because it's so true that we gave life to that data. And that's part of one of the charges that we have, is that communities have access to interpreting that data, but also having data sets that respect privacy, particularly like with tribal governments having data sovereignty issues. And so the way that we approach data, it is a living thing, and that we want to make sure that we're giving life to it from the people who are impacted, the people that are in those data sets. So I'm not just saying, oh, in Minneapolis, the Hmong community is not faring well, but that Hmong activists can say, this is what we're experiencing, and this is what the data show. And so I think the Atlas is incredibly important for that. We've also launched a rent debt dashboard recently. in response to everything that's going on with the pandemic, and there's going to be a rent debt crisis that's looming with so much joblessness and people facing this now a wave of rent that they're going to have to pay back from the various moratorium across the country. That this rent dashboard is helping to show that there's 5.8 million renter households behind on rent, and who are they? And how can we equip the advocates that are working on the ground in cities with the right data? So for us, the data is about the story and the storytellers, and how can we use this data to really illuminate the challenges that our communities are facing, and be really clear that it is insufficient to have these very high level categories, that equity is about understanding the deeper story, but that letting the people impacted tell their own story. And so, we take pride in the fact that we have an incredibly diverse team that backs up this tool through it's a joint partnership between PolicyLink and USC. But I think that's one of the primary ways that we've been able to use data as part of advocacy, as part of community engagement. And we've been able to see, certain policy outcomes as a result, positive policy outcomes as a result. And so we're heartened that the administration put out an executive order saying, we want to have this data working group and understand the ways in which we can have data that drives equity. But it's also going to require engaging people. Data should not live in a vacuum. It is something that gets animated by experiences, as you so lovingly pushed back on me in my own explanation of data when we first met. But yeah, I would love to hear more though about your frameworks and models.
Well, I wanted to pick up on something that you said about data and democracy, because I was looking, thinking about what today is. And so today for economists, it's one big deal today, and that is 100 years ago, Sadie Tanner Marcel Alexander got her PhD in economics, and Nina Banks' books collected, an edited volume of her speeches comes out today. So I was on a webinar earlier about that. And the other is about a year ago, I was on a webinar with Julianne Malveaux and Ann Price, and I'm going to probably butcher Junta's name also at Inside, and Jaribru Hill. And Jaribru made just that point about data that, hearing you say it again is resonating with me. And that is so often, she said, data is not a democracy, right? And that often the people who have the data, the researchers who are doing the work, are not coming back to the community. And Julianne Malveaux said earlier this morning on the webinar for Nina's book launch that eons ago, right, in the early 1900s, your W.E.B. Du Bois's Sadie Alexander and her husband didn't have access to the academy. And so often they were in the trenches, right? They were doing the research to have policy change. And I think that we're at this sort of crossroads where many academics are thinking about the ways in which their work can actually make change. And so when I've been thinking about what she said about data democracy, and when I made the comment to you about data does not tell a story, I often make it clear to folks that when we are talking about disaggregating data, we are talking about the mechanics, right? It is the ways in which you subdivide the data up front so that researchers can use an intersectional lens to talk about why this is happening. And I really hope for the young scholars that are in the audience that one of the things that they take away from our conversation is the ways in which our lived experiences are shaping the work that we're doing. And we'll begin to think about, when they're looking at data and they're thinking about questions to answer with that data, that they will think about what their lives have been like and the people around them. Because I think that as we're talking about this dominant narrative, it is so easy to fall into that and not take a step back. And I'm going to say that I'm going to define dominant narratives in two ways, not just in in terms of white people speaking, but I think also in terms of what is it that we're seeing in the press, right? So even the conversation about women back to work. I get so annoyed when I'm on panels and I realize they're not talking about women going back to work. They're talking about mothers, right? And it's like, how hard is it to actually say mothers as opposed to saying women?
Mothers and white women, so many women of color were essential workers already, so that weren't back to work.
So, and I had a whole thing about essential workers, right? That, even disaggregating that for us to realize that there are essential workers that got PPE, right? Everybody was really focused and thinking about healthcare workers, even when it came to the vaccine, right? Those were the people that you saw getting the shot. You didn't see people pointing to cashiers and, what we just saw happen yesterday, the cashier who was killed in Decatur, Georgia, for asking someone to put on the mask to be respectful to protect her, cost her life by asking someone, right, to pull on his mask, right, to pull it up over his face. So then even when we're talking about essential workers, that needs to be disaggregated because people have even different experiences than that. And I said last year on this webinar that there are certain workers who are expendable, right? And we forget that even in that essential category. So, when we're thinking about the work, I often say to folks that I'm often thought of as being provocative. So anyone who knows me will be like, yep, that's right. And I wear that. I proudly wear that because I think that what I want to come into a conversation and bring is the things that you haven't thought about, right? We often talk about marginalized populations, but we forget how easy it is to fall into the dominant, broad conversations and not think about who's being even left out in that conversation. So when I hear you talk about, the conversation about rent as a landlord, I'm always like, I hear people talk about the people who are the renters, but there's minimal conversation about the landlords. And the reality in some of this is if the landlords are not getting their monies and they have to put their properties up for sale, then we run the risk of having these larger organizations, LLCs, et cetera, coming in and buying these properties and really displacing people in the community who were behind rent, right? Because there's no one who's really thinking about how do you protect the landlord, right? So that they're not going out of business.
Making a distinction between small landlords and these larger
exactly landlords. Right. Exactly. And we don't want the large landlords to come in and buy the small landlords out because that can be detrimental for communities in terms of the composition and then who really has access to affordable housing, right? And so I don't think we have those conversations.
I do want to latch on to something you said though about the kinds of questions you ask, because I think that's another important thing. Is questions aren't neutral either, right? Like the kinds of questions that we need to be asking ourselves in these spaces. One measure of just how well is the economy doing? That question, and that it's answered with unemployment rate.
Yes. And
that seems to be a normal question, a normal answer. But what it's saying is that normal is having an unemployment rate where Black unemployment rate is consistently twice that of the white unemployment rate. So I'd be interested. Oh, you might have a response to that, but I'd be interested.
I was going to say, and we don't even think about the fact that you don't know what the unemployment rate is for Native Americans,
right? And
we don't disaggregate the unemployment rate for Asians. And if somebody's there from BLS, they're going to be like, yes, we do. I mean, because I've said this to them on Twitter and their response was, but you can get it disaggregated. But what you can get is unseasonal, right? Not seasonally adjusted unemployment rates and that's what a lot of us tend to focus more on. So, and I'm happy to hear you say that word normal, because I felt like at the beginning of the pandemic, people were like, oh, we want a new normal. And it's like the vaccine.
We can't go back to normal.
I mean, but I feel like the vaccine is out and you're not hearing people have that conversation about the new normal, which is why at the Women's Institute for Science, Equity, and Race, we don't couch many of our conversations around COVID. Like I tell them, we wink at COVID. And the example I give around that is thinking about somebody when you're doing a performance and you're in the spotlight, right? You come forward and you do your thing and the spotlight is on you, but when you fall back, you're still dancing, right? You're just not in the spotlight. And I worry that as the vaccines come out, as you were saying, as we're seeing this recovery that's supposed to be equal, no one's talking about the fact that the unemployment rate for white women is like lower than everyone's. Black women's is nearly twice that, and so is Hispanic women, right? There's twice the rate of white women, and there's no conversation about that. It is, for me, it feels as if for white women to be doing better than everyone else is a norm, not to be questioned in this conversation about an equitable recovery. And so when you're saying these things about questioning, I think it's not just that we're questioning the questions and the narratives, but also what we say and like what we do. And one of the things that you said that when we first met and had this conversation, and that was about outcomes, right? That it's not just about you say it better than look, let me not try to say what you said.
That equity it's about outcomes and not inputs. And a way that we like to think about it, it's like equality gives everyone the right to ride on the bus in any seat that they want. Equity ensures that there are enough bus routes that are, connecting people to jobs, to school, to doctors. And so that equity is about outcomes, where people are going. And it's not enough to just say, oh, we're doing the same thing for everyone. But if the outcomes are not reflecting it, then you're actually not invested in equity. And so my question though for you is that if, from your perspective, how do we then change these norms of, if I know I'm asking you to solve, my work challenges, but change the norms of the kinds of questions people ask, the defaulting to certain measures of the economy, like maybe rather than seeing like, oh, the unemployment rate is this, our economy is doing good or not, is, saying, oh, the Native American unemployment level is this, therefore we know, that our economy is doing better, or just how do we get to normalize using different kinds of data and asking the right kinds of questions from your perspective?
And I think that is the question, and I suspect Marie Mora will talk a little bit about this later with respect to econ. And part of this, I think, is about, and we mentioned this earlier, it's about who are the researchers asking the questions. And one of the things that I have been pushing around diversity and inclusion is we tend to think about this as shades of brown around the table. And we don't often think about it as the ideologies that are folks that are bringing. And so often I find that when people are talking about diversity, they want the hue with the same perspective. And I think one of the ways that you get different questions and you get better policy is to create spaces so that the provocateurs like me can walk in the space and it's not like, here comes Rhonda, but it's like, hot dang, right? This is about to be on because we know that she's getting ready to bring probably the missing perspective, and that it's not just the Rhondas, but it's, as you and I were talking in the prep, and we were like, oh my God, right? Like this is going to be an amazing conversation just because of our lived experiences and that we're in spaces where that is welcome, right? We're there to challenge and to question. And I think often we don't provide spaces for that. And I say to folks, look, if I have to be brave to speak, it's not a safe space, right? Because if it's a safe space, I shouldn't have to be brave to speak. But for me, I think what I want to really see people do in this, in terms of asking better questions, is to be critical, right? We often talk about how important it is to be critical thinkers, but there is a certain level of comfort in groupthink, right? That you can just fall in with the group and begin to chat. So for me, I think the biggest ask is to ask people to be critical. Who's missing when you see that policy? Who's assumed to be at the center of that? And then challenge people to think about who they've left out. So that's it for me. Critical thinking, like.
That sounds like a great stopping point. And provocateurs are what we want. I hope we can bring that energy into the next panel. Thank you so much, Tracey and Rhonda, for that great conversation. It's
Thank you for having us, Austin.
So much.
Yeah, thank you both. We're now going to have our panel. I'm going to introduce them, but first, let me just say we're getting some good questions. We're also getting some good comments. If you are dropping a question or a comment into the Q&A, please include your name, especially if your full name, especially if your Zoom name is not your full name, and also your affiliation, so I can make note of that. Thanks. All right, so we have a great panel. I'm going to introduce our moderator first. She is Rakeen Mabud. She is a political scientist like me, I should say, trying to make it in an economist's world. And she is the managing director of policy and research and the chief economist at the Groundwork Collaborative. Thanks so much for being with us, Rakeen. And then I'll just go in alphabetical order through our panelists. So we have Randy Akee, who is associate professor of public policy and chair of American Indian Studies at UCLA. We have Corey Fields, who is an associate professor of sociology and the Idle Family Chair at Georgetown University. And finally, we have Marie Mora, provost and executive vice chancellor for academic affairs and professor at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Marie is also the founder and former president of the American Society of Hispanic Economists. It's such a pleasure to have you all here today, and I will let Rakeen take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Austin. It's really always great to be in a room filled with all sorts of social scientists, from political scientists to sociologists to economists. And I'm really looking forward to all those perspectives really being brought to the fore today in this incredible conversation with three incredible experts that we have here to talk about how we can improve equity in federal economic data collection and reporting. So as Danny noted at the top of this conversation, it's really hard to change what we don't measure. The kind of data that we gather deeply shapes the questions we ask and the stories we tell about the economy and who it's set up to support. So in other words, there's a pretty direct through line between more inclusive data and more inclusive policymaking. So I wanted to start by asking Randy a question about your work. In your work, you focus a lot on inadequate sample sizes in existing federal data, as well as some of the difficulties existing surveys have in capturing outcomes of systemic racism. So could you talk a little bit about why it's important to disaggregate economic outcomes and some of the challenges that you faced in doing that work?
Great, yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all the organizers of this. You know, I think a lot of what was just spoken in the last session resonates with, you know, my feelings and my experience in being a researcher, trying to get data on small groups. I do a lot of work on American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, but also, as you heard two of the previous panelists speak, disaggregating some of our, you know, monolithic race and ethnic groups are also necessary because Asians have variation, Hispanics have variation, even Black as a race group in the US has, you know, lots of variation there, whether it's, you know, newly arrived immigrants from the Caribbean or from the African continent, or descendants of slavery, you know, in the US. So there's tons of variation that we lump together. And in terms of understanding outcomes, when we rely on those really big, relatively really big groupings, we're just getting the average effect. And we're really not understanding the nuances. And I think it was Rhonda Sharp who said, you know, it's at the intersection. That's where the rubber meets the road in some sense, where some of the really interesting, either beneficial or negative policy outcomes are realized, right? And so we've experienced some of that through the pandemic. We know that it's not all Hispanics who are adversely affected over the pandemic, but it was certain Hispanic subpopulations that are in certain industries, at certain occupations. Same goes for all these other groups as well. But sort of understanding that we have to be able to measure that, and we have to be able to see that in existing data.
That's really true. And I wanted to get at, follow up a little bit and ask you to dig in a little bit to, administrative data sets can be huge. And so to what extent will really, big data sets help solve some of these problems with disaggregation? And I think what the point that struck me from the previous conversation among many is really, Tracey's comment about inequality hiding in plain sight, right? Like, how do we start to get at that inequality that's really hiding in plain sight?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of administrative data, and I've been one of the beneficiaries of being able to use administrative data linked, behind firewalls in confidential use settings, where I've also, just like Danny Yegan, has also sort of used this type of data to conduct my own research. And it's particularly useful for, again, looking at small populations, because you might have the universe of tax filers, you might have the universe of respondents to the census, for instance. And that really makes it plausible and empirically viable to run statistical analyses where it's not really plausible or realistic, feasible, I guess, in other settings. And so that's where administrative data is quite useful. And especially if we're able to link across these different data sets. You heard earlier about sort of the inability to look at income tax returns because we don't have race data. Well, the Census Bureau has been able to do some linkages under agreement with the IRS to do exactly that. And I actually have been able to, with colleagues at the Census Bureau, to look at income inequality and income immobility as well, sort of the ability to see how the same person moves over time by race and ethnic group. And those kinds of data sets otherwise might exist in longitudinal sort of national surveys that we have, but only for the really big groups. So if you want to look at these smaller populations, however you define smaller population, that's not really going to be possible. So I think the possibility of using administrative data in those ways are going to open up a new world for us. But having said that, I am a big advocate in this idea of democratizing the access to these data sets. These shouldn't just be available for the elite, because there are a lot of researchers at a lot of institutions and in a lot of communities and think tanks that should also be able to, through appropriate channels, but still have access.
Thank you so much, Randy. And I just wanted to remind the audience that the Q&A box is open. Thanks for everyone who has already submitted some great questions. Marie, I wanted to turn to you next and kind of picking up on this point around democratizing data. You've done a lot of work looking at subgroups in the American Community Survey, and Census is launching a new initiative using the theory of differential privacy to add more privacy protections to these data. Could you talk a little bit about what those privacy protections look like and how this effort will impact the work of researchers like yourself?
Right. Thank you very much, Rakeen. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for being here. And I also want to thank Austin Clemens and the organizers of this fantastic event. I could not be more delighted or excited when I got the invitation. So thank you. These are extremely important issues, very timely issues, and they are very near and dear to my heart. You're right, Rakeen. A lot of my research over the years, in fact, going back to when I was a graduate student in the early to mid 90s, I've been looking a lot in terms of Hispanic socioeconomic outcomes, including entrepreneurship. But taking into account that, as Randy mentioned, when we think about the Hispanic or Latino population, it's actually quite heterogeneous. And sometimes when we hear reports, and we see this a lot with some of the reports that would come out based on federal data, we just hear about the Hispanic population or what's happening with Hispanic employment or unemployment, without understanding that there are key differences within the Hispanic population. We have differences in terms of our subethnic groups. So Mexican Americans are the largest group of approximately 60%. So when we hear about reports of Hispanic economic outcomes, we're really, a lot of times that's being driven by what's happening with Mexican Americans. But Puerto Ricans are the second largest group, Cuban, Salvadorans, Dominicans. We have a lot of different groups that comprise the Hispanic population. And then depending on where you live, we have different geographic areas. In some areas, for example, on the Eastern Seaboard, we have Puerto Ricans who are the largest group. And then in Florida, we have Cubans who are the largest Hispanic group. Although outside of the Miami metropolitan area, we're also looking at Puerto Ricans being the largest. So if we're only looking at the national aggregated data, we may be missing information on what's happening with the subgroups. We heard earlier with both Rhonda and Tracey talking about the importance of gender. So the experience of Latinas during COVID, looking at all the labor market outcomes or what was readily available to us, Latinas were disproportionately hit relative to Latinos, and including not just with unemployment, but also their labor force participation rates were affected. Differences in immigration matter as well. And so in the Hispanic population, you range from people who just recently arrived from another country versus a lot of groups, a lot of people have been living in what is now the US. Their families go back to areas that were not part of the US when the U.S. was formed. So that includes the island of Puerto Rico, with our San Juan being the oldest continuously operated capital in what is now the United States. So it was 1521. And so when we think about American Community Survey, it's my favorite data set. I love it. I love it because it is a very large data set. So you can do a lot in terms of disaggregation when focusing or looking at Hispanic groups. One of the things that concerns me about the recent announcement by the U.S. Census Bureau is that if there are additional privacy protections, that means that our level of disaggregation is likely to go down. One way to get around that is, well, if we had a larger sample, that would be a way. If we collected more data, then we could have more privacy protections built in and still be able to do disaggregation. But I completely understand that a larger sample would, of course, be more expensive to collect. And then as Randy mentioned, there may be ways to get around that in terms of looking at the administrative data, but that is also can be very complex in terms of just being able to access those data and have to be very clear in terms of the research questions that we ask. So I am concerned about the quality of research in terms of disaggregated groups and looking at intersectionality issues. As an economist by training, we often preach about the importance of perfect information. Then in order for markets to work well, we need perfect information. So how can we develop well-informed policy and equitable policies if we don't have complete data, if we don't have this type of information that we're looking at? And so I've been a big fan of the ACS, have used it for many years, and am concerned about some of the quality and the ability of me to do research, my current line of research, without if the Census Bureau moves forward in terms of the additional privacy protections.
Thank you so much, Marie. Your comment about women in the labor force and the extent to which women have been forced out of the labor force, particularly Latinas, really struck me in that it's not just about who we're trying to look at in the data, but it's also what questions we ask them, right? I mean, for a long time, we were not asking questions about caregiving and other responsibilities that disproportionately fall on women. And so that feels really important right now in this moment of crisis to start to broaden out the types of questions that we're asking in a lot of these big surveys. So thank you for your comments there. So I wanted to turn to Corey, and really was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the American Voices project that you've been participating at Stanford. And in particular, I'm curious about how other types of data collection, qualitative data, I've done a little bit of work on oral history, which has been really cool, could inform more traditional formal economic surveys.
Yeah, happy to. First off, I just want to thank the organizers of this event for putting this all together. It's been fascinating, honestly. Like the whole time I've been off camera scribbling notes and like making contacts with people I should be in touch with. And I'm excited to have an opportunity to talk about the work we're doing at the American Voices Project, because I think in some ways, this sort of interdisciplinary nature of this panel and this whole event, right, like speaks to the importance of listening to what other people are doing, right? Like maybe people outside, not just the people down the office from you, but maybe the people in the other building might be doing interesting stuff, or people at various think tanks or in government. So this has really been great. And, with the American Voices Project, we're led by a PI team with researchers from Stanford, Princeton, Georgetown, the American Institutes for Research, and a coalition of Federal Reserve banks. And the operations of the project are mostly housed at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. But what we're trying to do is provide immersive qualitative evidence on everyday life from a large sample of Americans that's that's representative of America, and trying to do that with a commitment to open, transparent research, right? So one of our goals with AVP is to make the data available to any researcher who wants to access it. I mean, it's a process and something we're working on, but the goal of the project is to collect data that anyone can use. And so most broadly, I would say our research mission is to hold candid conversations with a representative sample of Americans to learn how they're doing, honestly. In fact, we open up our interviews by simply asking respondents to tell us about their lives. And from there, the protocol goes on to address a wide range of topics, such as household spending, engagement with safety net programs, experiences with accessing healthcare, family relations, and political views, right? And that's just the beginning. That's not even the half of it. Some of the topics, are explicitly related to economic issues and economic activities, but I think the entire interview itself, right, gives you a sense of respondents' lives, right, which provides further information for how they're making economic decisions. So, we structure the protocol and train the interviewers to ask questions in a way that creates a sort of holistic, engaging conversation, right? And we also try to structure data collection so that we can combine interview findings with survey items, and with respondent permission, we can link it to administrative data, right? So we to sort of increase the bang of what we're doing with AVP. So we're hoping that researchers will be able to use the data to build better policies based on what we're learning from people. And we aim to, give researchers access to the kinds of perspectives from all different kinds of people living in the US. So in some ways, I guess we're trying to carve this third way, right? It's not sort of a big survey project, but also not a more sort of idiosyncratic, journalistic, qualitative approach, right? We're trying to sort of drive down the middle and have a larger sample size, a representative sample size, but one that engages that sample with a sort of open-ended interview process. And so far the results, it's yielding positive effects, right? We're working on a series of reports about things that have been happening over the 2020, right? Like throughout the crisis and political, I was gonna say political pandemics, but throughout the pandemic and political crises, we've been out in the field, right? We had to shift up the data collection approach because we were starting out sending out interviewers door to door. Then the pandemic happened and we had to shift to a phone online interviewing process, and that's worked out. And it's been fascinating to be able to be on the pulse of talking to people as they're living their lives through these sort of major changes and major crises. And a lot of the things that we've heard people talking about today have certainly emerged in my analyses of AVP data, right? Like I'm working on a report about sort of experiences of life during the pandemic, right? Experiences of COVID-19. And it's been fascinating in a way to hear everyone talking at an abstract level of like, oh, we've really been going through it with COVID. And it's like, okay, right. So at a surface level, if you were just to ask people, has your life been totally turned upside down by COVID, you'd get a lot of yeses. And it'd be like, cool, okay. But when you start to talk in detail about what that means, right? It's sort of fascinating because for some people, that's like, my life been completely turned upside down. It's like, oh, we're fighting over the Netflix queue all the time. And I'm so sick of working from home, right? But for a big chunk of our respondents, my life has been turned upside down. It's like, I don't know if I can trust my ex to watch our baby because she has asthma and I'm worried about her getting COVID. And so, you know, I can't just leave her, right? So it's this sort of nature of the experience is very different in a way that we wouldn't pick up if we only asked them, right? Has your life been changed by COVID? It's not until we're sort of talking about what's your life like right now, right? That we're able to extract those sort of differences in that variation. Now, that requires, you know, a different kind of work, but yeah, it's been fruitful. Yeah, so that's AVP in not quite a nutshell, but a general summary of what we've been up to.
No, that's super exciting. And I think it just speaks to kind of the texture that we all miss when we just look at the aggregate, right? And I think it was Rhonda who said, what we're trying to get at is the complexity of experiences and outcome of people's lives. And this feels like a really promising avenue forward to do some more of that. I have one more question and really this is for all of you. You know, I wanted to bring together two timely and important topics. And I think the first part of this discussion sort of teed us up really well for this. You know, in the idea that data doesn't tell a story, but researchers do. And so, you know, we've been talking today about data disaggregation and collection, but we also know that economics and social sciences more broadly are facing a challenge in increasing diversity in the discipline. And so I was wondering if you all could talk, and maybe Marie, you could kick us off here, about how the lack of diversity in economics and other social sciences affect the data that we collect and how research questions are shaped, but also what are some of the paths forward here?
I think that's an excellent question. And actually, it was touched on a little bit in terms of the previous panelists. One of the issues that we have in economics, and you mentioned the other social sciences, when we think about the importance of diversity, it's not just talking about having a diversity of how people look. It's really trying to get that diversity of perspectives and lived experiences so that we can bring our insights into interpreting the data or asking questions about the data, like why are we finding this? What does this really mean in terms of being able to tap into the communities? And I really appreciate Corey's comments in terms of the work that they're doing, because that's one of the ways to really get into that. I've worked for many years to try to diversify the economics profession, which does have a big problem with diversity, both with gender and also with respect to race and ethnicity. One of the reasons I'm one of the founding members of the American Society of Hispanic Economists is because a group of Hispanic economists got together and we were essentially complaining that we never saw either Hispanic economists or Hispanic economic issues presented at the annual conference, the Allied Social Science Association. And so rather than just complaining, nobody will listen to us, we did put that into action to launch that. I've also been fortunate to have funding for the National Science Foundation for the American Economic Association's mentoring program, which is designed for PhD students from traditionally underrepresented groups in economics, and also new PhDs. And that's a way to build community and to have this mutually supportive network for emerging minority economists. And so that's part of the efforts that are being done out there. We need to think about, again, when we are looking at the data, we need to think about not just the interpretation, but what questions are not being asked, or where do we have the gaps in terms of data analysis. I was fortunate to have served a couple of years on the board of directors for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas's San Antonio branch. And what I loved about that is part of our mission as directors, we were supposed to collect what they called economic intelligence. And that is, we were supposed to go around and just listen to people. Because when the Fed is conducting monetary policy, they need to have as much data as they can, but data often comes with a lag. And so as sophisticated as the data collection efforts are of the Federal Reserve System, they were really trying to get a jump start on that by understanding what was happening at the local level. So they looked at their directors as having the boots on the ground and to be able just to report back. So we talk about, hey, there's this major highway construction project. What does that mean in terms of employment? Will that divert traffic? What does that mean in terms of the businesses that are along that particular route? This is one of the reasons that in order to be on these boards of directors, you actually have to live in the areas that you're representing so that you can report back on what's happening on the ground. And you can give that insight in terms of, again, these lived experiences that we've been hearing about.
Thank you so much. I don't know if Randy or Corey, you wanted to jump in here.
I'll just jump in and add to what Maria said. I think one of the downfalls or one of the downfalls of not having more diverse social scientists is that we are sort of leaving a whole bunch of interesting research and outcomes and evaluation of policies on the floor, on the ground, right? Where there are lots of things that could be evaluated that would be informative to fundamental ideals and fundamental questions in social sciences. I'll tell you just a brief example of something that I've been working on with other colleagues for a number of years now, is looking at a lot of American Indian communities have been providing universal basic income for about 25 years now. The vast majority of people in the United States don't know that. We've got a whole bunch of RCTs going on in a lot of different places, which is fantastic, but we have a track record of that. We can tell you whether or not it affects labor force participation, whether or not it affects poverty, whether or not it affects educational attainment, and the answer is it does in the good ways. From the community that we have, we have one community because we have data on one community, and there are hundreds of communities, dozens out of the hundreds that may provide this type of universal basic income. And these are sort of examples that could inform our policy debates that we're not talking about. Other communities in other parts of indigenous America are combating climate change in various ways, because often our communities are sort of on the outskirts of society in that sense, in sort of, the most environmentally fragile, and are coming up with the innovations that may inform policy choices and decisions in the future. We just don't see those. So there's lots of these things happening in multiple dimensions for multiple communities. And I think those are the things that we don't realize we're not taking advantage of. And nobody knows about them unless, as Marie was saying, you come from those communities because you see them with your own eyes.
Right, thank you. And that's such a important, it has such important policy implications, right? Because if we are not creating policy with the people who have historically been forced to the margins in our economy in mind, then we're not actually creating policies that support our whole economy.
Let me just say, add to that though, but it's also informative for the bigger populations as well.
100%.
That's the other part, is that it's fantastic and important for our communities, these smaller communities, but it may also be informative going up aggregating up. And that is a part that I think many people don't realize, that there are potential benefits here. Our insights actually translate. It's not always, top down. So I think that's an important point.
Absolutely. Groundwork, we often say we are the economy, right? If we are not doing well collectively, then, our economy is not doing well. So I think that absolutely captures that idea. Corey, I wanted to turn to you.
Yeah, I was just gonna sort of tap on, I think both Fleury and Randy have both made excellent points about the importance of, having different voices, right? Like diversity, giving different people access, right? But I also think, and some of this comes from my own research on organizations, race within organizations, but it's not just about having people there. It's also about letting people have a platform, right? And so oftentimes what happens with these conversations around diversity, right, it becomes a case, it's like, yeah, oh my God, we love diversity. We want different people involved. Absolutely. We want you to look different and be different, but like you also need to really be the same when it comes to the stuff we care about. And so, every organization has to deal with this tension of like, how do you incorporate different people yet still stay true to who you are? But I think all too often what that happens is, you can get in, but you have to sort of speak in ways and talk about things in ways that align with what, gatekeepers within the organization want to hear. And that's just a recipe for, what I like to call decorative diversity, right? So like everybody looks different, but everybody's saying the same thing. It's sort of, like we're so diverse. You like skinny jeans, I wear khakis, but we both do the exact same thing. Look how different we are, right? I think, in terms of creating a space where we can hear from different voices and let them, let those voices, provide different takes on some of the same questions that people are grappling with. I think that's where, in some ways, the magic happens, right? Like not so much that, oh, I'm going to come into sociology departments and bring some unique Blackness word, right? I mean, that might happen. I do carry unique Blackness with me, but I think the more sort of critical thing is like, I'm going to come into sociology and grapple with the questions that sociologists have been grappling with, but I'm going to do it from a perspective that's grounded in what I know and where I came from, right? And so like that's going to bring, different perspectives, right? And this is not just sociology, but like organizations more broadly. So, I think, another way to think about this is like, it's not just enough to have people in the room. It's like people in the room have to be able to speak and be heard, right? And it's, and I don't mean this in just like an empty formal way, but in like a true, like, can you say stuff that doesn't toe the party line and not get punished for it? If the answer to that question is no, then people aren't going to say stuff, right? And I think, within any organization, even if you think you're doing well on diversity, you think you are hearing, you have the people in the room, you have the voices, it's still important to sort of check in with those folks and make sure they feel like they can talk. Because if they don't feel like they can say anything that, is off message or off record, then what's the point, right? Like you sort of aren't doing it, you're creating a new set of problems. So, I guess this is just a long-winded way of being like, yes, I agree with everything that everyone has said. We definitely need to diversify these spaces, but it's also about, sort of providing people with outlets to be in the room and have an impact.
Thank you. That was such a great summary of a very, very complex conversation. So I wanted to ask one more question, and really, the Census Pulse survey is a little bit different from your typical economic survey. And Corey, I hear, has had the sort of researcher nerds, data nerds dream of being able to answer it. So I wanted to start with Corey and hear a little bit about what you thought about the questions they're asking there, but more generally for the rest of the panelists, how a survey like the Census Pulse survey might show us a way forward for federal surveys. And Corey, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, I don't have anything sort of particularly magical or insightful to add, right? It was sort of super cool when I got it, and I was like, oh, whoa. And it's funny because I was working on some AVP stuff pretty much like literally when I got the email to do it, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. And then, I thought it was like a well put together survey, right? Obviously, quality people are working at the census and working on the Pulse project. But what was striking to me in some ways was doing it, I was like, yes, I feel like I'm answering these questions and like these are good questions. But I was thinking through, I had just been reading transcripts, right, of like hour-long interviews with people. And I was like, right, like, yeah, we're essentially talking about the same sorts of things in like different ways. And on the one hand, I was like, I absolutely think it's important that, the Census Pulse is gathering this data, but then we're gathering this data in a different way, right? But at the same time, I was thinking like, it might be worth a conversation to figure out like, are we sort of doubling up work? Or is there like some way to start a communication there? It's like, oh, right, we're doing this, you're doing this, maybe we can sort of find some middle ground where we're both getting stuff out of it. So, I am a huge fan of, the efforts like the Pulse survey that are aimed at gathering more and sort of specific data, right, that's sort of like more current and of the moment. So yeah, I'm pro, I guess, in terms of if it's like a referendum on the Pulse, count me as pro. But, I also think, that I found myself thinking like, oh, there's so much more that could be done with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one last reminder and plug for the Q&A box. If you have questions that you want this wonderful panel of experts to answer, you can put in your questions in the Q&A. Marie and Randy, wanted to just see if you had any final thoughts or thoughts on this particular question before we start to pivot.
I think, being able to have this very flexible way to collect data quickly is a fantastic tool moving forward. I had served 2 terms on the Data Users Advisory Committee of the Bureau of Labor Statistics several years ago. And they'd always talked about that as a possibility as well, that if something happens, they could embed additional questions into the current population survey so that it was a way for researchers to be able to tap into some of the current events and have some data access for that. I think that is an extremely important tool. And nowadays with our technological wonders, we can do so many things that were not possible even 10 years ago.
I'll just agree. I think it's fantastic. I love the speed at which it operates and the diversity of really interesting questions that were asked over time. The downside again is that you can identify 3 race groups, 1 ethnic group, and that's as disaggregated as we're able to go.
Well, thank you all. It's been such a fun time moderating this panel, but I think I'll turn it back over to Austin for some Q&A.
Yeah, so we got lots of great Q&A, and some of these are directed, some of them I'm just gonna ask, who might have an opinion on it, because we really have a great diversity of questions. So let me start. We've got a number of questions about tax data that I want to just kind of put all together, and maybe y'all can kind of take these together. So first, from Professor Jeremy Barra-Friend at George Washington Law School, in my paper, Should the IRS Know Your Race?, I note that the omission of race and ethnicity from published tax data analysis is not only a longstanding practice at IRS, but also at Treasury and at the Joint Committee on Taxation. Meanwhile, many scholars outside these institutions have included race and ethnicity in publications that use administrative data. Is it true that our federal tax data institutions don't have capacity to do what these academics have already done, or is it just a willpower issue? Then I have Lorena Roque at the Center for American Progress. What are data practices and protections that the federal government should look out for when releasing data by race? For example, critics of the data working group have said that the IRS knowing the race of tax filers could lead to targeting. What would you recommend in terms of data protections? And finally, I have Emma Sifra at the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and she asks, should disaggregating tax data by ITIN status or ITIN, I'm not a tax expert, so I'm not sure what the cool way to say this is, but that's filers who don't have social security numbers. Should that fall under the scope of what the Biden administration is doing under this executive order? And I guess these are probably questions that Marie and Randy will have some thoughts about. So I'll just open it up to you all on all 3 of those.
So I know that Randy has, I was going to turn it over to Randy since he has been able to work with administrative data. I would say though that one of the concerns that we'd already pointed out when worrying about adding additional levels of protection, it's always going to be a trade-off in terms of how much data are released, how much potentially personally identifiable information is there. That's always going to be a concern, trading the privacy versus information. Again, so my preference is we would have even larger samples so we could better disaggregate without having the ability to to be able to identify the respondents. But again, in terms of why we may not see more of that, a lot of it I would expect it comes down to cost.
And so just, again, on the privacy part, the tax data is protected by Title 26 and census data is protected by Title 13. So again, there are very strong federal laws against the release of that kind of information. And so things must be, released in a disaggregated and approved manner. So nothing gets released in that way. And so, I think one of the questions was, does release of, if the IRS had, race data, would that be targeted? Would that allow targeting? I'm not exactly sure what that means. Targeting by outside groups, targeting by the IRS itself. I mean, the IRS already has your social security number and your address and your income. They have everything they need. So I'm not sure of if it's an agency concern, the agency has everything. But if it's from outside groups saying, this group is rich and they're of this ethnic group, perhaps that's an issue. Nevertheless, you could still get that kind of information from public use data that we have already from the ACS, for instance. One can just create that. So, I think, I think it has to be a political will for data sets to be merged, for data sets to be managed, and for these linkages to happen. Again, the concern is the release of, personal information, the personal identifiable information. And my sense is that, the agencies are well equipped to protect against this. So I don't think they've been doing this for generations now, so I don't think it's necessarily an obstacle to continue to do that. The question is there the political will to really link across different agencies? You know, the Scandinavian countries have been doing this, again, for years, and are able to produce some really intergenerational analyses of, you know, health impacts of various policies, income mobility, occupational change, lots of different things. So it's possible in other countries. So we have experiences and examples of it.
Great. I think this next question is probably, we'll probably let Corey field it first, but I'd be fascinated to know if the economists have opinions on it. So the federal government has occasionally recognized the value of narrative surveys. For example, during the New Deal, the Federal Writers Program captured the experience of Black Americans who were alive during slavery. Should the federal government once again be in the business of narrative history, or how does that contribute to what we can think of them doing?
Short answer, yes. Why not? Get in that business. It's a good business. A decent returns on investment there. No, I mean, but yeah, I do think there's certainly merit in gathering different kinds of data, right? So in some ways, the kinds of questions we want answered aren't always going to be questions that can be answered with a simple survey or with, by filling out forms. Sometimes it's important to know, right, the context in which behaviors are occurring. So like with, AVP data, we know that like, oh, unemployment rates are going up, right? So it's like, we can just look at the sort of survey, do you have a job or are you out of work, and get that. But when we talk to people about what's happening in their lives, we actually hear stories about how they're managing unemployment. So it's like, yes, I'm unemployed and what this means to me, right? And so it's also interesting in some ways that people who fall out of the category, that's what's been most striking to me about AVP data, like reading the AVP transcripts, is not so much that like the people who are unemployed talking about their problems, but the people who haven't lost their job talking about how they have to manage unemployment of people in their networks, right? So it's like, oh, I'm still working, but my uncle lost his job. And so like now I'm kind of having to help take care of him. And then you get to hear, sort of all these sort of specific details about like their family relationship that produced that, which are fascinating and interesting. But, you get the headline story of, oh, just because you haven't lost your job doesn't mean you're unaffected by unemployment, which is something that, yes, everyone knows, right? And we would all head nod to, but it's not until sort of hearing the narratives of people's lives that you come to understand what that actually looks like, right? And what implications that has for, people's behavior. So, right, I am a huge proponent of sort of expanding narrative data collection, right? Like gathering more, having people tell stories about their lives, and then analysts sort of taking those stories and telling a different story, right? So yeah, so actually I absolutely think there's room. And I think in some ways to truly, achieve the kind of representative data collection that we're talking about, right? Like it's not just about talking to different kinds of people, but it's also about gathering different kinds of data, right? Like that will sort of give you a full representation of people's lives. So I don't think, the thing we're doing is the only thing to do, but I think it's something that we should be doing, yeah.
And let's put more sociologists in federal government, right? Does anyone else want to respond to that one at all before I move on?
I just wanted to tag on to what Corey was sort of rounding out his comment with, which is, it is about getting deeper into the stories and the ways that people are interacting with these moments, because people don't live in silos, right? And aggregate data often forces us to think about problems, look at issues in silos. But that has huge policy implications too. The better we understand what people's experiences truly are, the better we can actually create policy that meets those needs and meets those experiences. And I think we are doing ourselves a disservice by not trying to go deeper, because it's only when we go deeper that we can actually come up with the policies changes that I think many of us want to see.
And I'll just jump in very quickly. Again, not the federal, not when we think about our official federal government data collection, but thinking about the Federal Reserve System in terms of how they might be able to deploy their boards of directors, both their district banks and also the branch banks, to be able to bring in that perspective and help them interpret the data that they're looking at, because they're looking at all these data dashboards, and where they get the perspectives from the ground many times are through these directors. And the more that those directors are truly representative of the communities that they are designed to represent, then we'll get more, again, more informed policy information that comes from them.
Great. Let me, did you have anything on that, Randy, or should I move on? Good, okay. Let me, this is a question from Equitable Growth's own Kate Bond. I think it's actually a really important, great question. What efforts are there to collect intersectional data that includes sexual orientation and gender identity on the same survey? There's not a lot of this being done right now. So I don't know if anyone has perspectives on, you know, what might be done in the future, what we should be doing, what has been, you know, fielded, and so on and so forth.
It is obviously a very important question, and that is some of the, when we talk about or thinking about some of the missing data that we have, certainly sexual orientation would be one of those. There's a way to tease it out, or there is a way in terms of American Community Survey, if you look at people who might be in same-sex couples, but that's not the same as collecting information on the based on sexual orientation. I would like to give a shout out to a previous colleague of mine, Gary Gates. In fact, he was at UCLA for many years. He was somebody that was instrumental in terms of having that information, the ACS, to be able to identify same-sex couples. Has since retired, but I'll put a link to his website in the chat box, because he does actually have a little note there about LGBT data collection amid social and demographic shift. And so I'll put that in terms of some of the most, he would be most up to date on that.
Yeah, and I'll follow on Marie's comment. He used to run the UCLA Williams Institute, which is at the UCLA Law School, which does some of the best research on LGBTQ, transgender populations, doing economic analysis in particular, and also legal analysis. So yeah, the Williams Institute is fantastic.
Great. We just have a couple more minutes. Oh, sorry, Corey, did you want to comment?
I was just going to say, I mean, one of the interesting things that we've been doing with American Voices, when people tell their narratives, right? We can sort of back code it at the end. So it's like if someone's talking about their lives and they're, you know that the respondent identified as female, and they're talking about, the struggles they've had with their partner, and they sort of talk about, their partner being a woman. It's like, oh, okay, well, we didn't ask this, but we do have, a way of sort of gathering information about sort of gender identity and sexuality of respondents. I mean, so it's actually been one of the sort of interesting things that has been particularly useful for me in terms of the reports I've been working on with AVP, is being able to, because you have these sort of long winding narratives, you actually are able to, I guess, in some ways impute characteristic onto respondents that you don't actually, you don't necessarily get in the standard demographic survey questions that we ask. So, I mean, it's definitely like an issue I know a bunch of sociologists are thinking about, and I won't name names because I'll be embarrassed that I'll forget someone, but if Kate wants to email me afterwards, I'm happy to connect her with folks who are grappling with some of these issues in terms of survey, like how to ask these questions in surveys.
Great. We just have a couple more minutes, so I'm just going to wrap together about 3 questions here, and then let's go around the horn one more time. I'll call on people, and you can respond to as many of these or as few of these as you wish. So first of all, we got 2 questions about different kinds of workers, and so we got a question on YouTube about how BLS does not report on interns, and then we got a question from Dave at the Temp Worker Justice who asks, he says, there's an EEOC exemption that allows temp agencies to not report demographic data for the 3 million daily temporary workers. I did not know that. That's very interesting. Are there other gaps like that? And I guess let's include the interns thing in here too, that could be undone by purely executive or administrative action without Congress. So that's one question. Second, I have Jason Vasquez, and I'm sorry, I can't see your affiliation here, but he asks, is there a role for advocacy organizations in this effort to modernize national and state data infrastructures? The answer is definitely yes, but I'll let other people elaborate on that a little. I had one more. Oh, and then maybe this one. So this is Mike Hernandez says, I work at a nonprofit that collaborates with other nonprofits and social service providers. Do you have any recommendations or best practices around taking a pre-existing social services program and responsibly extending its scope to gather data in the interest of helping policymakers and researchers? So we can maybe abstract that away a little from that particular context and just think about if people are gathering data themselves, what's the best way to do that to inform people and to help researchers like yourselves? So let's start with Randy maybe, and then we'll just go around.
Yeah, that was a wide variety. I think, I don't have a lot of answers for those questions. I think, that there was a question about what can it be done administratively without, lots of changes in via Congress. I do think if we're able to, I think it's a question of, devoting resources to, especially in the context of data disaggregation and, devoting resources that allow for oversampling, that allow for investigating of communities that are underrepresented in existing data sets, whether qualitatively or quantitatively. So my take on that is, are we able to use existing budgets to allocate more towards the, greater representation in those data sets? Also, I think, we have a, sorry, Connie Cittrell just made a comment related to the last question that you were talking about with regard to sexual orientation and gender, and that it was actually intended to be included in the last 2020 census, but was nixed. I'll also add to that, there was another category, Middle East, North Africa, MENA, that was also sort of extensively tested, and it was set to go, and that category as well, sort of talking about disaggregation, which currently that population is under essentially white, I believe, under existing race groups. So again, examples of where these are agency-specific changes, and OMB in particular can have an impact upon.
Great. We're low on time, so Marie, you have 30 seconds.
I guess just very quickly in terms of the question about, and you already answered it, Austin, in terms of saying yes, there would be certainly a need to rethink some of our data collection infrastructure, both at the federal level and also at the state level. I think that would be something that is of great interest. And part of that is putting more resources into the data collection agencies to be able to address some of the issues we've been talking about here today.
Yes, if you work at the state level, be a friend to your state level data collection agency. And Corey, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I guess I would just I would just jump in about this idea about advocacy groups and sort of researchers who aren't connected to universities or big research projects. I absolutely think there is room and a need to have those voices in the data collection process. And I mean, I guess I know at AVP, we're always wanting to hear from outside organizations who would be interested in partnering with us in terms of like getting access to the data, but maybe even thinking about like additional questions to add to our protocol. So I guess my first response would be, if you have an interest in a research project and there's a data set that you're interested in, reach out to the people who collected that data, who created that data set, and start a conversation, right? I think you'd be surprised at the extent to which people are actually open to hearing outside advice, outside input, but also outside perspectives, right? And outside direction in terms of thinking about the kinds of data that needed, right? So in some ways, you have to hear those outside voices saying, hey, we need this data and we can't get it. And that for me will trigger like, oh, well, we could do X, Y, and Z, or like, oh, I know somebody who's doing something else. So I would say, yeah, definitely reach out. I think, you know, there's a lot of openness to making that kind of thing happen.
Great. We're going to have to end there. We're just slightly over time. I want to thank everyone, our panelists, Marie, Randy, Corey, Rakeen, for being here. Thanks so much to Danny Yagan, and of course, Rhonda Sharp and Tracey. We really appreciate everyone being here, and we appreciate everyone attending. If you had comments in the Q&A for a specific person, we will pass those on. This conversation has been recorded and will be on Equitable Growth's YouTube channel. I believe there was a link dropped in the chat. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.